Welcome to the Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast. Our goal is to help you maximize your church's potential. You'll hear from top leaders in children's, student, and family ministry about the principles and practices they use. Now here's your host, Nick Blevins.
What's up? Welcome to episode 240 of the podcast. In this episode, I talk with two guests, Paul Basden and Jim Johnson, who are co-pastors of Preston Trail Community Church. Now, if you've been listening to this podcast for some time, you may recall that I've interviewed Allison Lehman, who serves as the NextGen pastor at Preston Trail Community Church, great leader. And prior to that, in that same role, Cindy Fiala used to lead in that role at Preston Trail, and Cindy's been on the podcast a couple times as well. And so I love Preston Trail Community Church and what they're doing. And in this interview, I talk with Paul and Jim about their new book, Finding Your Place in God's Great Story for Kids. But more than that, we also talk about what it's like to be co-pastors. I mean, they're legitimate co-pastors of the church. It's not one leads the other or one, does one role and the other leads the other. They really lead it together and have started the church together, which that is more and more common now, certainly than it was, 20 or 30 years ago, but it's still not that common. And so I asked a lot of questions. I was just curious about what does it look like with leadership? How do your gifts complement one another? Does it help with some of the burden, that I know pastors carry? Does it help, being a co-pastor that way? How do you lead staff? Do you divide that up? All those kinds of things. Couldn't help but explore some of that, even though most of our conversation is around the book. The book is really one of three that's going to come out. It's just this one, kind of geared towards the preteen age, came out first. And so we talk about the content of that as well and how that can help kids. And so I think that's going to be helpful to you too. Hopefully you'll love the conversations about church leadership and structure and all those dynamics as well. You can get all the links and notes at nickblevins.com/episode 240. Before we jump into that interview, I want to remind you that last week I mentioned on the podcast ClearStream, a great service for texting. If you're not using some type of mass text service program in your ministry, you're really missing out because text messages are opened at like 97% or something like that. Whereas if you were doing a great job with email, maybe you're 35 or 40%. And for a lot of folks, it's 20 or 25% of emails get opened. So, I don't think it's an either or. I think churches should have a social media communication strategy, email communication strategy. Shoot, I even think there's times still when you can use regular mail for some parts of your communication strategy, but also text. You don't want to leave that piece out, but the answer probably isn't texting from your personal phones kind of thing. That's a different kind of communication strategy for a personal connection. You need a mass texting solution, and ClearStream is a great one. You can do all the things you would think you would need with a mass text solution, such as like keywords that people can use to join, follow-up workflows, which I love for like first-time guests, things like that, two-way communication, personalized messaging. It's really helpful to use all of those things to communicate with people, and I don't think it's an all or nothing. It's, use email for this and use social media for that, and then use texting for specific things. Like I know in our church, a lot of it is about a call to action, or, I mentioned that we're doing this 52 challenge where you can subscribe to get a verse from the Bible every week sent to you via text or email. And we use text messaging for that and a workflow, just like I mentioned that ClearStream has. So they work with thousands of churches from new church plants. We got a new church plant in our network that's starting this coming Sunday, actually, and all the way till churches of thousands, tens of thousands. So they're used to working with churches of different sizes and different church management systems like Church Community Builder, The Rock, Planning Center, things like that. So check out nickblevins.com/text to check out ClearStream, get started on a free trial. And then if you do know a church plant like the one I know starting this weekend, who I will absolutely be pushing to ClearStream, they can use ClearStream free for 12 months, which is really cool. So check that out at nickblevins.com/text. And now listen into my conversation with Paul and Jim, PB and JJ, as they call each other, about their new book and the dynamics of co-pastoring a church. Well, in this episode of the podcast, we have Paul and Jim both on. Welcome, guys. I don't know who wants to go first and introduce themselves, but we want to hear about you all and a little bit of your story and Preston Trail. So who's going first?
I guess I'll go first. This is Jim, and Nick, thank you for the invitation to be a part of this podcast. I grew up in West Texas in a town called Midland and enjoyed watching oil wells being drilled and mesquite trees growing out in the suburbs. So it was not all that exciting a place aesthetically, but the people there are really awesome. And grew up, felt called to ministry at a young age. Went to Baylor because at that point in time, if you're going in the ministry and you're Baptist, where do you go? You go to Baylor. I went to Southwestern Seminary. And then after that, while I was pastoring a rural church south of Waco, I did a PhD in Christian ethics. And I always thought that a pastor should be ethical or at least know the loopholes. So that's when I decided to study Christian ethics, I think. I have been married for 45 years. I have 3 kids. My oldest is a law professor at Penn State. So we get to make the drive from Texas to Pennsylvania every now and then. So that's nice. My middle son is an actor in LA, and my youngest son is a writer in Austin. And I have 3 grandkids in Pennsylvania, which is probably the most important thing. Yes.
Yes. So are you ever going to move there? See, that's the question. Is like the grandkids, are they going to draw you out of Texas, or are you going to?
Yeah, I'm hoping I can get them to move to Texas.
That's what I figured. That is the Texas answer. That's correct.
That's right.
All right, Paul.
Yeah, my name is Paul Basden. Glad to be with you as well. My sweet wife, Denise, and I have been married 44 years this December. And we have 2 girls, Carrie and Kristen. Carrie is married to Jared, and they have our 4 grandsons. Those boys are truly the lost boys out of all the Peter Pan movies because they wrestle, they knock each other over, then they back at each other up while they fight the neighborhood.
And they talk about body parts.
Yeah, they sure do. They're little boys.
Sounds right.
Soccer all the time. Our other daughter, Kristen, is in culinary school, and she made some blueberry pie that Jim and I had this past weekend.
Yes.
It did not help our figures. And then she continues to make stuff. She's a good cook and a great sports fan too. Born in Dallas, Texas, lived here till I was 8. And then, Nick, I moved to Richmond, Virginia. My dad took a job up there, and so our family moved. And while I didn't dislike Virginia, I never got over my love for Texas. So the minute I could apply for colleges, I was interested in a dozen. I chose one, Baylor. I applied to one, Baylor, came down here, met my sweet wife down there, finished up after 4 years, went to Southwestern Seminary in Fort Worth, and Jim and I became friends there, doing our MDivs together, sat by each other in systematic theology class and realized we knew each other from college, but not well. And then that began a whole new friendship that has been one of the most meaningful things in my life. And then I also did my doctorate. Mine was in historical theology. I realized I had a lot of bad theology during the Jesus movement. If it felt good, we thought it was from Jesus. If it made you high, we kind of spiritually high, we thought it was from Jesus. In fact, that was one of the musicals back then. It was called Natural High. But the truth is there's a lot of false teaching. And by that, I mean just shallow. And so I just kept wanting to study, and I kept wanting to learn more and get the deepest well I could. So to me, theology would help clarify what I needed and fix up my my thinking that wasn't good.
Well, I know we're going to talk about things that most listeners of the podcast are ready to hear about, but I have to ask, you still celebrating the Baylor winning the championship? Right?
Yes, the national championship. Absolutely. Yes. Coach Scott Drew is quite a coach. He's a wonderful, genuinely authentic Christ follower too, which makes it really good. So he's very easy to support.
Yeah. My wife's uncle went to Baylor. Huge fan. Was so excited about that. So I don't even watch college basketball that much, but I keep somewhat up with some of those things. But now I want to talk about Preston Trail Community Church, where you 2 co-lead as pastors, which is a conversation we could have anyway. I'm sure people would love to hear about that and how that works. And if people have been listening to the podcast for a long time, they might remember Allison Lehman, who is on your staff and leads NextGen there, has been on the podcast. Cindy Fiala, who used to lead in that role before she moved, has been on the podcast probably a couple times, I believe. But in case somebody's listening for the first time, tell us about Preston Trail Community Church, how it got started, and how you co-lead it, which is unique for sure.
Yeah, I'll jump in. It's easy to describe, but it's hard to do it. But here goes. Our church is a non-denominational church. Frisco is north of Plano, which is north of Dallas. So if you drive downtown to Dallas on a busy day, it will take you over an hour. If you want to get up to the Oklahoma border or Lake Texoma with no traffic, it's about 45 minutes. So that's where we are, far, far north of Dallas. Jim and I began talking in 2001, late 2001, about the possibility of starting a church. He was a successful pastor in Atlanta. I was at a church doing well in Birmingham. And the truth is they were good. And you know this, they were good churches with great people, but it's difficult for them not to be stuck in their ways of continuing to do church the same denominational way. And, I didn't have anything against that method. I just didn't think it worked for the future. And I knew in my mid-40s, I couldn't keep doing that. I knew that wasn't the hill I wanted to die on. And it wasn't the people, obviously. It was just the method, the whole worldview for church. So I called Jim and said, hey, are you open to praying about this? And so we prayed all fall of 2001. And in early 2002, moved our families down here. And as we love to say, with no people, no money, no land, no building. Somebody said, hey, whose idea was this? And we looked at each other and said, God, we hope it's God's idea, because there wasn't any church that ever wanted to do it for us. So that's how we got started. And it was a great way to get started. People used to ask us, you may remember this, Nick, there's that book by John Ortberg, If You Want to Walk on Water, You Got to Get Out of the Boat. People walk up to us and say, as we were leaving, I bet you've read that book. And I remember hearing that so often, I finally said, well, I haven't, but I guess I should. And it really was a description of the fact that we had no fear during that time. And I don't think that that's really a virtue in our lives. It was just the grace of God. But we weren't afraid. We were mostly excited. And an adjective we use a lot is we were desperate to be a part of a church that we thought would be a kingdom impacting church for the whole next generation. And for us, that's what motivated us.
That's awesome. We're going to talk about a new book that you have that's released, Find Your Place in God's Great Story for Kids. And it's kind of going to be part of a collection of some other books too. But I have to ask more about CoLeading. That's something I've asked Cindy about it, and I've asked Allison about it, but I'm sure people listening want to hear too. And it's more and more common, right? Some sort of plurality of leadership in churches, but it still seems so uncommon within the grand scheme of churches that it's interesting to talk about whenever we can. So what does that look like practically? And what are some of the tensions and the benefits of having that model? And I think people will say, is it really co-leading or is it not? And you just say it is, you know what I mean? Those are the things people think. So tell us what it looks like.
I'll start. You pick up. It is actually true co-leading. We are co-senior pastors, and we have done that from the beginning. We actually, when we were planning the church, kind of divided up roles and responsibilities. But one of the things that has kind of kept us together is we always gave each other a veto power over the other person's leadership in that particular area. And the deal is, I never really wanted to veto something Paul was leading in, because if I did, he might veto me. So the deal is, after almost 20 years, we've never vetoed each other in a particular area of leadership as we divided up the responsibilities. But it truly has been the best experience in my life in ministry. Planting a church, as you all know, probably it's very taxing. A lot of church planters don't make it past the year 5. They burn out. Sometimes they disqualify themselves because they don't know how to get out of it otherwise. But we have never been close to that, because we both communicated. That is, we both would take turns speaking, and we also took turns being the kind of the executive pastor as we started. So we've been able to remain healthy emotionally and spiritually along the way, and that's really helped us through these 19 years. We often kid by saying, between the both of us, we make one pretty good senior pastor. That doesn't mean that we work part-time, however. And there are 3 primary reasons why we think it works best. Number one is we trust each other implicitly. As Paul said, we got to know each other in seminary. Our families actually vacationed together for 9 summers in a row as our kids were young. So we trust one another. We have that long friendship. Second, our gifts are very complementary. That is, the things that Paul is really good at, I'm not so much. Where he really loves plugging in, I don't as much, and vice versa. And then also, we say it like this: we have different preaching styles, but no, we have the equal competence, but different preaching styles. And over these 19 years, we've never had anyone or a movement go and say, "Oh no, it's not Jim again," or "It's not Paul." That they truly appreciate the hearing God's word from our different life perspectives. And I think our church has actually been enriched by that. So, PB, what are the advantages and the disadvantages in your mind?
Let me add one more thing. Nick, we had not been here long, maybe 2 or 3 weeks in the spring of 2002, when we came upon a scripture verse that became a basis for what we do. Now, I'm not suggesting that you can't co-pastor unless you have a scripture verse. I'm sure that there are a lot of things in life you can screw up with a scripture verse just because you're stubborn. But this really guided us. Since Ephesians 5:21, submit to one another, therefore, out of reverence for Christ. And it hit me very clearly because I knew my own ego, not as well as others who have suffered from it, but I knew enough that if I did not say consciously, I must submit to Jim Johnson, even I'm accountable to him. And if he did not say that back to me, I knew that it wouldn't work. I also knew that it wouldn't have worked in our 20s or 30s because I just had to be right. I had to be at the center. And by this time, it was like, okay, I'm willing to half the time not be in the center of anything and be not irrelevant by any means, but not at the center. Of course, now I realize, and here's the advantage, the incredible relaxed feeling of not being at the center of everything about half the time. It's just amazing how de-stressed this job has been. In fact, I don't recommend this. I've not lived out my vacation in years, my full complement of vacation, not because I'm trying to work so hard, but just after I've had several weeks, I'm just fine. And I realized that if I were senior pastor, I'd be begging for more weeks. One other thing that's really cool, and this is, I don't know how to explain this. I can say it and then I'll try to talk around it. I believe that my strengths cancel out Jim's weaknesses, and I believe that Jim's strengths cancel out my weaknesses. It's not just that his strengths are at their best and mine are at my best. I mean, his strengths really cancel out my weaknesses. I'll give you some examples. I'm a recovering people pleaser. Just my whole life I grew up, especially in my teen years, with my mom modeling this, be nice to everybody, be sweet to everybody. And one time I said to her, Mom, are sweet and nice part of the fruit of the Spirit? She goes, well, honey, they just mean love. And she was just a Southerner, a Tennessee girl. And for her, just making everybody happy was the goal in life. Well, I inherited enough of that, and I have to fight against it enough now that it can become a demon, and it can get me in trouble and cause me to try to trim areas of my life or trim ministries to get the applause of certain people when I really don't need to. And every time I've talked to Jim about that, he has talked me off the ledge. No, we're just fine. But Jim, they left the church. So we're just fine. But they don't like us. So we're just fine. But what if we're wrong? It's okay. This whole thing's an experiment. We'll figure it out as we go. And all of that is just like, okay, so I don't have to let the whole church feel my anxiety. No, because his strength there truly minimizes and cancels out my weakness. And that's why I think that what we do is descriptive, not prescriptive. I don't know that many people can do it, not because we're so special, but just because there's so many factors that go together. He mentioned 3. I would even add the fact that we read the same theology we did beforehand. We read the same devotional books we did beforehand. If I had a hardcore charismatic, strong Pentecostal view of Christian life, and he had a hardcore, strong view of Calvinism, we would not have made it, because you can't have a church that split down the middle with 2 different theology approaches. If each of us had the very same leadership acumen and the very same finance drive, we wouldn't have made it. So there are a lot of reasons why it has worked. He told you some, I've told you some more, but man, it sure has been good.
That's awesome. It raises another question I hadn't planned to ask, but now I'm thinking about it. You mentioned the anxiety, some of that. One of the things I feel for with pastors right now is just on a Zoom call yesterday where this was voiced, whether pastors would say it or not, I think there could be a pressure. We were talking about attendance. What is your attendance now compared to pre-COVID? And I think you said it's about 70% if you look at a couple of years ago compared to now. Our church is about 52, 55, here in Maryland. And that's what I hear. I hear 40 to 60, some 70, and what I heard the other day was that a guy who works and coaches some pastors, there are some churches where the board or whoever that is, the committee, is holding the pastor accountable to those pre-COVID numbers, which I just think is crazy. But what I see a lot of is pastors themselves, even if they don't say it out loud, bearing the weight of that. And I wish I could just wave a magic wand and say, that is not any person's responsibility or fault or in our control. Is that an example where maybe you don't feel that weight as much because there's 2 of you and you can help each other? Or would you say, nope, we still feel them just like we did when we were pastors of our own church by ourselves?
Certainly the helping each other, the Ecclesiastes 4, 2 are better than 1. We live that out every week. I don't know that I have felt pressure in terms of COVID numbers and reaching that, but I will tell you early on, when everybody was having to negotiate in February, March, and April, what to do about COVID, I know that on my own, we wouldn't have made nearly as good a decision as we did with both of us. And so I know that I did not feel stressed then because we talked it through 1,000 times to the nth degree. And but I don't feel that same pressure now. That could just be our church, and because we're founding pastors and no one's going to say it to us.
If you don't say it to each other, right?
You know, one of the things that really has made this work is that, so I'm big picture, kind of visionary, and I can come up with 100 ideas a day. Paul is a great refiner of ideas. And so as we look back across our history, I think one of the reasons why we started literally with 2 families. I mean, when you stop and think about planning a church with just our 2 families and going through all of the stages of growth and overcoming all the growth barriers at 200, 400, 800, 1,200, whatever the case is, to go from there all the way to where we are now. And before COVID hit, we would say our parish was about 10,000 people. But one of the primary reasons, I believe, why we were able to do that, apart from the grace of God, was that between the both of us, we made good decisions. That is, that we never made a bad decision that derailed the church. But if I'd been a solo pastor, because I'm a charger, I'll move ahead, I would have run the thing off the rails 2 or 3 times. And Paul, in his refining of ideas and directions, helped me make better decisions, helped us make better decisions. So I really attribute a lot of our success to the fact that we were doing this together. And I know that on my own, I truly would have run this off the rail at least a couple times, in the 19 years, if I was actually still here, right? So, yeah. So
one last question about the dynamic. We could probably just talk about this the whole podcast. You talked about complementary gifts and things like that. And certainly I'm sure it looks so different now than when the church was 600 or 800 and you had however many staff, and now it's much larger with more staff. Do you still use those complementary gifts in terms of the areas that you oversee in the church? Like, Paul, you oversee these ministries and these staff, and Jim, you oversee these, or does it change a lot? Like, what does that look like in a reporting staff structure standpoint?
Yeah, for the first 10 years in the life of the church, about every couple of years, we would say, hey, is there anything in here we need to change? Here are the 5 areas I've got. Here are the 5 areas you've got, Jim. Are there any things we need to change? And we did that regularly. One of the great gifts in life to a senior pastor is when you get an executive pastor. And the truth is, our current executive pastor does so much and does it so well that I oversee almost nothing in the life of the church. Along with Jim, I'm super closely connected to worship planning, and we're involved in that on a regular basis, series planning and regular worship planning. We're deeply involved with our executive staff team. But beyond that, there's not a particular area. But I think your point is right. Jim still, in all of our executive staff meetings, or I guess you would call it staff leadership team, that's the 8 people or so, Nick, that we work most closely with. He still casts biggest vision. And, how about this? How about this? Could we do this? And I'm listening, evaluating, and then sometimes my best gift is kind of a pastoral word to that group, because I'm a shepherd teacher and Jim's a visionary communicator in that. And it's really nice that the church benefits from both of us.
That's awesome. Well, let's talk about the book that we said we were going to talk about. And it's really more than one book, but this first one that's out now, Find Your Place in God's Great Story for Kids. We talked a little bit before we started recording, but how did this come about? How did the book come about? What else is in store? Because I know that's not the only one. And then I want to talk a little bit about what's in the book, but tell us about it. How did it get started?
Paul, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. We preached a sermon series in the summer of 2015 called God's Big Story. Had a great time just going through the highlights of the scriptures, saying, if we were to take 8 or 10 areas, what would be on that big arc, or some people like to use the fancy word meta narrative, which doesn't even make sense. Come on. But you think of the big story in scripture, what are the big chapters? And so out of that, we came up with 8 big ones. The first one with creation story, the second one with the beginning of the nation of Israel with God blessing Abraham, the next one with David as the king, the next one with Moses, sorry. Yeah. Then David is the king, then the prophets, then Jesus, then the early church, and then John the Revelator, and of course Revelation in the end and the new beginning. So we did that series and we had the best time doing it. Just loved it. We had people on our staff who creatively put together all sorts of visuals and funny little linking ways to tie the big stories together. So, for example, between Moses and David, I mean, there's hundreds of years, 400 years. And one of our staff members, Allison Harrell, wrote this thing called The Story Between the Story. And it's a little tongue-in-cheek summary. I mean, Eugene Peterson in the Message didn't even do it as well as she does because he's much more verbose. But, man, she's just quick, clever, and
don't speak of the dead that way.
Well, Saint Eugene. But I'm telling you, she nailed it for us on that. And so we kept that in the book. But by and large, that became an 8-week series that people still talk about and just have loved it. And one day we were talking to our editor, president of the publisher, and he said, "Anything else you got in your mind?" And Jim said, "We got a series we'd like to talk to you about."
Yeah, we talked to them about that series, and they were excited about it. In fact, they flew us out to their headquarters, and we really brainstormed a series of 3 books. And one of our primary reasons for doing this is just the biblical illiteracy that is just prevalent today in the church world, not simply just in the secular world, but in the church world. And there are probably 4 or 5 reasons why there is such biblical illiteracy inside the church. I won't go into those, but we just wanted to make sure that people would have a framework of understanding the biblical story, because we tend to, in our preaching or even in our teaching, we kind of pick passages of scripture from the Old Testament, New Testament, and most people have no idea about the framework of God's really larger story. And so we said we want our people to really understand this huge story, but also begin to understand that they have a place in it too. So as we shared that with our publisher, they got excited about that. So they asked us to do an adult version of God's big story. And then they asked us to do a tween version, 9-year-olds through 12. And that's the book that's out right now. And then there's also a version for littles, for like preschools. And I will tell you an interesting story about that. My son, Tyler, took our adult book and he kind of kidified it for 9 through 12-year-olds. Well, Paul's daughter, Carrie, she took the book and she reduced it to a kid's story. So now I want you to think about this. Here's a story of the Bible: creation, blessing, God redeeming Israel, David, the prophets, Jesus, the early church, and in the end. So she only had 100 words to talk about each of those 8 chapters.
And each chapter was 4,000 words. So she had to drop it from 4,000 to 100.
So 100 words about creation, 100 words about Abraham. And I mean, she did an incredible job. And as a matter of fact, I can't wait for that version to come out, because it will give young preschoolers an opportunity to begin to process the arc of God's redemptive story. So we're excited about it, and we're looking forward to all 3 of them being released sometime soon.
Something else, Nick, you grew up Southern Baptist just like Jim and I did. And one of the best things about that is you have great Sunday school when you're a kid, great teachers, et cetera. One of the worst things about that is you have no idea how every story fits together, right? So one week you get Daniel in the lion's den, and the next week you get Simon Peter on Pentecost, but you don't mention tongues, of course, because you're Baptist. And then, then the next week you're going to have Jesus healing somebody. But the truth is you have no idea how it all fits together. And so the thought that parents can sit down with their younger children, or you said you're reading it with your 8-year-old, or Jim's 8-year-old granddaughter's already read it. So the fact that the thought that kids could read this and go, oh, I see where this fits in, not just because it's an intellectual exercise. That's not the goal. The goal is not to know more. That doesn't make you love God more. The goal is to see the big picture. So you say, so that's the God that I love. Well, no wonder I love him. So we're really excited about that.
Yeah, I would say even when I think back to my childhood, there were probably times that I recall, or even when I taught Sunday school for a little bit, that we were doing some of a chronological study, but certainly as a teacher, and even as a student, I don't know if I remember hearing it as part of the bigger picture, which as a kid, that's easier to understand than all of the little pieces, even if they are in some type of chronological order. So I do love that. How did you land on the 8, instead of 6 or 14, or, you know what I mean? Was that like, as you're planning the series, it just came that way? Did you debate it a good bit? Did anything get cut or added?
Okay.
How did that come about?
I'll give you the spiritual reason is because we felt like God was leading us to do it this way. The non-spiritual reason is we knew we had an 8-week summer series that we had to plan. So we divided it up into 8 weeks.
Yeah, but the truth is, it would be hard to figure out what else to do. I mean, because you think of creation, you think the creation of the world, the creation of the nation of Israel, the salvation of the nation of Israel from slavery, the monarchy, the kings, and then you move. The only thing that we missed, but that we actually deal with it completely, in both in the story between the story as well as in the chapter on God warns of the prophets, is simply the exile. But I mean, that's built in. Yeah. And then you get to Jesus, and you get to Paul, and you get to John in the end. And it's like, well, what else could we have added? So we did have 8 weeks. But if there had been 10, we would have done that too. But it made so much sense to us.
Yeah,
sure. Now, in terms of, I think one of the things I love about it is kind of what you said earlier, Jim, just the illiteracy when it comes to the Bible. You may already know this, but you wouldn't be surprised. I think it was a few years ago when Lifeway did that study of Christian parents now, what was most helpful to them when they were kids getting raised in their faith. Number one was the Bible, reading the Bible. It wasn't prayer time or meal times or certain experience with their family. They were on the list, but they were much lower. It was reading the Bible. And that just continues to show with like every survey I ever read about faith and growth and all that. So that's one reason you're excited about this with the book. So tell us a little bit about how you hope the book could be used, obviously in individuals' lives, but even in churches. I'm sure you would agree. It's, as church leaders, it feels like we're in a time where it's even more difficult to help kids and teenagers read the Bible.
For me, I think our huge hope and dream from the beginning was, by doing 3 versions, that we would give parents a tool to have these kinds of conversations with their kids, and they could read it too, and they could even read it to their littlest ones. And so it really created a curriculum of God's arc of redemption, right? And so that they could really study it, learn it, have conversations about it together. So that was behind a lot of it, was to be able to offer a tool to parents that they could learn themselves and then also teach their children. But I have an idea, Paul, we haven't talked about this. I have a feeling there are going to be a lot of parents who read our tweener version that's just come out to their 9 through 12-year-olds. And I think the parents are going to learn a whole lot that they didn't know and understand before as well. So it may actually be helpful for parents to read that. We have a lot of our volunteers who come on and teach in our NextGen area when they kind of in entry-level positions. And they say, I didn't really know the Bible until I started being around it and then having to teach it and that kind of thing. So I do think having parents guide their kids through this version is going to help parents as much as it helps kids.
We also hope that churches will find this useful for curriculum for younger middle schools or older high schools. I would just think that 4th and 5th grade small groups could do this for 8 weeks, and it would be a great opportunity. It so fits into the Orange curriculum concept of the big picture. We'll have these on our Orange Hall, just like you probably have at your church with some books out there. And again, that would be our greatest desire, is that kids read it, study it with their parents, study it with their small group leaders, and go, I know that God, I know he made me. I know he's coming back for me. I know he died for me. I know he still warns me, and I love him, and I'm going to follow him for my life. So we hope that this will motivate that in the lives of 9 through 12-year-olds.
Yeah. And when do the other ones come out, roughly? I know it's books, so who knows with schedules, but
6 to 8 months each.
6 to 8 months each.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, Nick, you may not know this, but Amazon tabbed this book the top new release in children's Bible book and interpretation book. So now what that may mean is there are only 2 books that are released in that particular category, but we've got the top one. So,
or it could be 200. You never know. You never know. That's awesome. That's great. Well, hey, that really does help more people see it, which is a good thing, right? I mean, how many, just like staff at your church, I'm sure you get questions all the time. what book would be good for my kid with this or whatever. And this will just be an awesome book to recommend for parents of kids young and a little bit older, once the younger version comes out, which is great. I want to kind of shift gears again to something you mentioned before we start recording about your strategy change, I'll call it, as a church. Before I do those, any last thoughts about the book? We'll tell people at the end where to get it. Obviously, Amazon, some different things like that. Anything else you'd want to add about the book, though, before we change gears?
Not from me.
I'm good.
Take it away.
Thank you.
All right. You definitely intrigued me when we were talking about this before we were recording. You talked about how you feel like the strategy and the approach with Preston Trail Community Church is changing a little bit now since COVID. You said from come and see to grow and go. And I think that's something everybody wants to hear about, because even before COVID, I would say there was a tension between, I don't love the labels, but attractional or missional. Right. I don't love the labels because I thought attractional was very missional. And I think missional in the right way could be attractional, the whole thing. But I think culture is going to need it even more. So if that was a tension before, I think it really is now. So describe that. What are some of the changes? What's the thoughts behind the shift there?
It's really interesting how God kind of led us through the process. So when COVID hit, we could no longer meet, at our building at that particular hour of the week. And we're going, okay, that means the church can't gather at a location, but we're still the church where we live, work, and play. And we were also aware of the fact that church attendance has been dropping significantly in the last 20 years. And so it just made us start thinking, all right, we need to rethink how we're doing church. And so we started doing some other things to try to kind of get us through COVID. Like we started some neighborhood ministries, and we were really trying to get our people to get with other people from our church in the neighborhood. We call them neighborhood champions. And we wanted to really push our ministry outside the four walls of the church. And so as we started doing more things like that, I started going, well, wait a minute, we're doing all these new things because of COVID. Are these just random, or do we need to start connecting the dots on them? Are we doing these now because God is leading us to do that? And I think as we sat and started thinking through and praying, that we realized that no, we still want to be gathering on the weekends. That's simply a part of what it means to be the ecclesia. But we realized that what we had not done, we've been focusing almost all of our attention on 3 hours a week. And yet we had not equipped our people very well at all to live out the 97% of the rest of their life for Christ. And so we started going, man, we need to rethink that. And so that's when we started processing it. And so we want people to come on the weekends, be a part of a group, and really begin to grow, but not simply for the sake of growing, themselves, but so that they could then go and truly be on mission where they live, work, and play. So we have a little phrase now. We say, we want to grow as followers of Jesus so we can go wherever he leads us. And so we're putting that out. We're beginning a new series in a couple of weeks, and we're going to really drill down on helping people understand, what does it mean to grow as a follower of Jesus? And then what does it mean to go as a follower of Jesus as well? So it really was kind of out of the upheaval of COVID and God leading us to do some things that we started trying to connect the dots and see, is there a new vision or a new strategy that he's leading us to? And so that's kind of where we are right now.
Let me add a little bit to that as well. Exactly 100% what JJ said. And, we started this church with a seeker perspective. We had been heavily influenced by the seeker movement. And by that, I mean Willow Creek and Saddleback and even a little bit later, North Point. So we were very convinced that you could have a great worship service, not a show, not entertainment, but a great worship service with creative elements, a lot of praise towards God, communicating the gospel in ways that people who were not believers understood. And we talked a lot about Venn diagram of, just two circles. And if you take everything that a Christian needs to hear and everything a non-Christian needs to hear, and you just find that intersection, well, man, just find that shaded section and just preach and teach on that all day long. And we did that for 18 years. I don't know that we would have changed had it not been for COVID, as Jim pointed out. And so what we had to do was we had to say, well, we weren't wrong in what we did. It was a good thing that we did. It was a good thing that we did the come and see. Almost every church in the last 20 years has done come and see, 30 years maybe. It's a new one. So the conclusion was, well, the other thing to say, Nick, is both Jim and I were irritated at and never very receptive to the missional movement. The reason is there was part of it that was fabulous, as you know. But there was a part of it that often got anti-institutional and anti-building. And I mean, we appreciate the organic nature of the church and its institutional side. You know, it's an organization as well as an organism. And we felt like that there was a throwing out of the baby with the bathwater. But in the meantime, we were not very interested in running in those circles. But man, during COVID, we realized there's so many things that are missional that are right on target. And as long as we both have people here to train them and then to send them out, then we are exactly on target. And that has been one of the great joys, is just helping people realize that. And I had a guy say to me the other day in my men's group, in fact, he said 2 times in the last 2 weeks, well, I remember from our Vision Sunday 2 weeks ago when we heard all about the grow and go, that's what we need to do. So I know y'all are making plans on that. And he heard it just one time, but he's already processing how the church will look different. And he was talking about reaching people in his neighborhood and how that he has a new vision of that now. So I think it's going to play very well for the next several years.
That's great. Well, I always felt like I was probably the same as you, that some of the things that I hear from the missional side I didn't love. Some of it was also seeing it tried a number of different ways. I would say that a lot of times it had too much of that anti-establishment thing going on, which is probably why it didn't work quite as well. I mean, sometimes actually a lot of folks I know that would do that, man, the stories of the people that they would reach were just inspiring, just awesome. And I always wished, and maybe that's what you guys will find here, is that you could get a little bit of a marrying of the two, that you could be somewhat institutional, but just the power of the evangelism that those folks with the missional mindset would have, but with none of the negatives or the hatred towards a certain model or whatever. So maybe that's what will come about. That'll be a great thing to watch, with your church over the next few years. That'll be awesome.
There's
I'm sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I think it was Tony Morgan. It was someone who was making a comment about the nature of the church, which really resonated with me. He said, if you're a missional church or a house church, you can make disciples, but you're not very organized. And we've had a lot of institutional churches that were really organized, but they weren't really making disciples. And his comment was, and I think it was Tony, who said, now what we're going to discover are some organized churches who are actually making disciples. And I think that's our goal, to be organized and to utilize the resources God has given us. And there are certain things that you can do, especially in NextGen ministry, when you have a place and you have leaders who are devoted to that and you have those kinds of resources you can't do in small meetings or groups around the community. So we believe that there is a genius to the and so in a sense, come and see and grow and go is really where we're headed. Those two things make one pretty good, I think, mission and strategy when all is said and done.
Yeah, I agree. That sounds like Tony Morgan too, so it probably was him. Last question. Having known Cindy Fiala, who was on your staff for however long, and Allison Lehman, from afar, that when I talk to them, I feel like your church champions NextGen, kids and students, family ministry, as well as any church. And we don't have to talk about why you do that. That'd be preaching to the choir. Everybody listening would say, yes, you should do that. But, or even how, I mean, sure, we could do a whole podcast probably what that looks like, but what's the heart of that? Is that something you guys were passionate about when the church started? Did staff like Cindy and Allison help carry that? I mean, I know you have done weekends, specifically focused on that. There's just a lot here. We have this book. It's clearly a core part of your church. And where does that come from?
First off, as you see in the book at the very beginning, we dedicate it to 3 people: Amy Mixon Martineau, who was the very first staff member that came to work with Jim and me and coordinated a huge children's program, and then Cindy Fiala, and then Allison Lehman, because they've really taught us the power and the value of NextGen ministry. No, we did not come to do that initially. I did not move down here thinking, hey, let's be a NextGen church. In fact, I never heard the phrase NextGen. But something unusual happened when we got here. And since a lot of this comes out of Jim's history in Atlanta, I'm going to let him tell this.
Yeah, well, when I was a pastor in Atlanta, Andy Stanley kind of broke away from First Baptist Church, and they needed a place to meet. And so we opened our facilities up to North Point on Sunday evenings for about 18 months while North Point was building their facilities. Andy's always quick to remind me that wasn't totally altruistic, because we did use it to kill our Sunday night services. So it was very, yeah, it was a win-win. But I got to observe and watch them create kid stuff at Kimball Bridge Elementary, and just to see Reggie Joyner and their organization begin to truly reach young families in ways that I'd never seen before. So when we moved here to Frisco, we had done some demographic work, but not deep enough. And we got here and we discovered something, that there were more children birthed through 4 years of age living in the Frisco Independent School District than all students grades K through 12. Think about that for a moment.
And it was one of the fastest growing cities in America and has been for 20 years. So it wasn't like a little outlier. I mean, these were young families moving here.
So we said, listen, if we're going to reach our community, we have to reach young families. And then it just kind of went ding, 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 ding. And so North Point and what they're doing with the kid stuff. And so Paul mentioned Amy Mixon Martineau. We hired her. She was a theater graduate from Samford University in Birmingham. She was so happy to come and be on staff because she said she had never had a salary with a comma in it. So we were actually going to be able to pay her, a decent salary. And so we did kid stuff. We Texanized it and called it Dude Ranch. And that's how we launched the church for the first 4 months. Paul and I never preached. He was Dr. B, I was Dr. J, and we were the ministers of announcement. And it was we had some incredibly gifted and creative people. So that was really in the DNA of the church, to reach young families. And so that DNA is still there. And Cindy came along and she kind of fanned that DNA. And now she brought on Allison, and we're still going strong because it's in the DNA. And we've had some incredible leaders who've joined us in that.
Yeah. Also, about 6 or 7 years ago, we began working on trying to state more clearly our church's values. And as we worked through that, we ended up with our very first value was think family. And once we said think family, that became for us almost a North Star. And that's not saying that, the nuclear family is the most important thing in the world. We know the kingdom of God is the greatest family of all. And a lot of people that do not have any kind of healthy nuclear family or even that option find their home in our church and in your church. That's real super common. And thank God for the family of the church. On the other hand, if we don't help parents with their kids, who's going to help them? If we don't help marriages come together, they're not getting any encouragement in the world. I mean, if anything, the world is about as anti-marriage as it's ever been in my lifetime. And so how in the world can we do anything to strengthen the church and not at the same time, or maybe even first, figure out what it means to strengthen the family? So that has been a drive and a motivation really since the beginning. I do remember this about a decade ago. Jim and I watched over probably a 4-month period, people come to us just one-on-one. And I'd say to him afterwards, say, golly, the story from that couple was miserable about their marriage. He'd say, me too. The next week he'd say, I met with another couple who was just miserable. And in that context of it's about 2010 or so, again, over about 6 months, we realized we have to pay as much attention to marriage as we have been paying to parenting. And so that moved us into a ministry that we do that we learned from a church around here called Reengage. And you just can't believe, Nick, how many couples have come and found their marriages whole again, couples that were divorced that have gotten remarried, couples that were in good shape that just said, we just don't want to get bored and tired and take each other for granted. How can we just move up a little bit more? So we care about the next generation and trying to bring wholeness to the parents that are working in those homes and sharing with those kids.
That's awesome. I know everybody's listening. Maybe be a little jealous because, if you're a kids leader, a student leader, you just want maybe more than, I don't want to say more than is warranted. Sometimes kids, student leaders have a hard time seeing the whole church and all the other priorities. You know what I mean? But you definitely want there to be a big priority for families. So that's great. Well, guys, thanks so much for taking time to come on the podcast. How can people get the book and even keep an eye out for the future releases? Amazon, obviously, any other ways they can connect with you or the book? Go ahead.
365discipleship.com. That is our website, 365discipleship.com. You can also find that same handle on Twitter and that same handle on Facebook. We have a page there as well. But any of those ways will get right to us. On that particular website, there's a spot at the bottom that talks about the books. It will send you to 3 or 4 sources: Barnes & Noble, ChristianBooks.com, Books A Million, and a local bookstore if you like one of those as well.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, guys, thanks so much for writing the books as they come out, and for taking time to share about it on the podcast. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Nick.
Nick, thanks, buddy.
That was a really fun conversation. And I think most of the conversations I get to have on here are fun. And I think some of it's just because I love talking ministry and what's working, what's not working, what are the challenges, what are the uniquenesses of a church. And that one certainly is unique with co-pastors, leading and sharing that role and obviously doing that in a great way. So I'm telling you what, Preston Trail Community Church is a great church. And I hope a lot of churches, mine, yours, will prioritize families, like they have the kind of leadership culture they have, care about reaching people who are far from God like they do, and adapting. We talked a little bit about what they're doing a little bit different now with approach and their model. And I think every church needs to do that, even without a pandemic. But certainly with that, we all need to adjust. So you can get all the links and notes at nickblevins.com/episode 240. I would encourage you to put this book in front of parents in your church who have kids that age. I'm reading it with my son. I want him to keep reading it on his own over and over. I mean, it's God's great story, right? And I just want that to be in my kids. If you have kids, I know you want that as well. If you're leading in a kids ministry, you're going to want that for sure. And I look forward to the other 2 versions of the book coming out. That's going to be a lot of fun. Check out nickblevins.com/text if you want to look into ClearStream as a text solution for your church. And make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any of these episodes. The next few are going to be ones that I actually recorded before the pandemic and held on to because they kind of, revolved around in-person gathering. And that was on hold in a lot of ways up until recently. So the content that we talk about is timeless. You're going to love those interviews. We'll have those over the next few weeks. Until then, I'll catch you in the next episode of the Family Ministry Podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast. We hope this helps you maximize your church's potential. We would love to hear stories of how you apply what you've learned. You can do that by leaving a comment on iTunes or in the show notes at nickblevins.com.